Hay. I'm currently the project manager for voter service and education at the League of Women Voters of California. And today you have me as well as Whitney, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself. Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Hi, I'm Whitney. I'm from the Center for Civic Design, and with my partners Dana Chisnell and Drew Davies and a whole army of people who helped with this research, we did the research behind the best practices manual.
Great, thanks, Whitney. Before we dive into the content of today's webinar, just wanted to give you some additional background information. So this is the third webinar of 4 in a series of webinars, and the first 2 was earlier this week. The first webinar is up online at cavotes.org. We're currently working on getting the second webinar up online, and we'll be posting this as well as the next webinar on our website later next week. So I want to thank you all for joining us in these webinars. It's exciting for us here at the League of Women Voters because we just celebrated our 95th birthday. And throughout our history and starting out in this movement for suffrage, we've been advocating for voter rights. So when looking at the kind of information that is available to us specifically for voters, we understand the challenges that community groups and election officials have when trying to disseminate this information as well as what goes into this information. And we've been lucky to be able to partner with many registrars across the state for the last several decades. Now, when looking at the most recent election in November of 2014, we saw that only 31% of eligible Californians voted, and young people and people of color continue to be underrepresented. So although many factors contribute to low voter turnout, we believe that voter information is an important tool to engage and expand the electorate. And we understand the role of official voter information, of official voter guides in particular. So we joined forces with Center for Civic Design, you just heard from Whitney, to conduct some research which is informed by diverse stakeholders, including election officials, community organizations, good government groups, frequent and infrequent voters, and even potential voters. So those folks are really at the heart of this research and this manual that we're looking at. The next partner that we worked with is FOS, the Future of California Elections, which is made up of election officials, civil rights organizations, and election reform advocates. And then finally, with the financial support of the James Irvine Foundation, none of this work would have been possible. So when we looked at this voter information, we wanted to find ways to make it more effective, more inviting, and more useful, which is why we came up with this manual, this best practices manual for official voter information guides, to be an easy-to-use resource to help election officials and community groups educate the diverse electorate that we have here in California. Now, some of the recommendations in the manual are already being implemented in some of the counties across the state. Some are very simple fixes, but we recognize that some of the recommendations are actually a bit more challenging. They may face regulatory, legislative, and financial barriers. So we would love to invite you to share any information that you may have if you face some of these barriers and these challenges, because we're invested for the long term. We want to figure out how to break down these barriers to get this voter information and these voter guides in the hands of the voters and potential voters in the right way and in the right time, that they can be able to feel confident going into the next election. So for the next slide here, there's a pull quote. We understand to raise voter confidence and increase participation, we actually must learn how voters get information and how we can implement some of these best practices. So that's why we have this webinar here for you today. And we hope that you have a great experience not only through these webinars, but also using the manual. So we want to be a resource to you. Please contact us if you have any questions, and we want to continue partnering with you. So for today's webinar, we're talking about civic literacy. We want to know what those gaps are and how to bridge those gaps. And then also thinking through, for those folks that are coming from the election official side, how do we get this information to voters in a quote-unquote official way, how that information is presented. And then finally, personalizing the voter information to let the voters know what is actually in the guide for them and what's just more general information to help bridge those civic literacy gaps. So that's the overview and background about the project, about today's webinar. But there may be some overlap in content in some of the other webinars, but that is all in the manual itself. So let's go ahead and dive in, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Whitney.
Well, hi, guys. As Jen said, we welcome your questions, and you can type them in at any time, and we'll take a break at the end of every section so that we can answer questions as we get to them. We don't forget about them at the end. When we started working on this project, we were focused on voter guides and voter information pamphlets, and so naturally, we started by thinking about the artifacts themselves, the actual physical guide. But as we started doing the research, we began to realize how important it was not just to think about the pieces of paper that we put together, but the bigger picture. To whom are we sending these things? What's our relationship with these voters? And what are the challenges that voters and non-voters might have in reading that guide within the context of what they already know about elections? Because there's as I'm sure all of you are well and painfully aware, there's a wide range of knowledge about how elections work. And one of those challenges is that when we talk to people, especially new voters, they often didn't really know where to start. When we asked them about voting, they had the big picture, that big democracy picture, and they understood about having their voice heard and being part of democracy, but they often didn't have a very good picture of where to start. Now, sometimes this was because they might be a whole family that's new to voting, or they're just a young person, and while they sort of understand that their parents and their friends of their parents did this thing called voting, they didn't have a good idea of what actually they do. As one person put it to me, well, ma'am, he said, what actually happens when you go to the polling place? I know you go there. How long do you stay? What happens? Do you have to be there all day, or do you just go in and do your thing and leave? So some very basic levels of knowledge about what it means to participate in an election. And when we sort of boiled down that collection of questions that we had, we think that there are three big pieces. One is just a whole set of information about where to go, when and where, and how they're going to vote, and what their choices are. The second big one is getting down to the specific election, which is what am I going to vote on in this election, so that they can think about those decisions before they get to the polls or before they sit down to mark their ballot. And then lastly, we heard very, very strong interest in having nonpartisan official information that they can trust. Now, sometimes they thought that would come from the election office. Sometimes they thought it would come from people in their community who they looked up to as people who would give them authoritative and accurate information. But they were worried about being skewed. They could tell the difference between official guides and campaign literature. So thinking about that whole range of audiences, we do think that different types of voters have different needs, right? People who aren't yet voting, there's a lot of reasons why people don't vote. Sometimes they just don't know. They didn't get down to it. Maybe it feels a little mystifying. We talked to one young woman who had recently become a citizen after moving here from China, and she said, "Oh yes, we're going to vote, but we're still kind of getting ourselves grounded," right? There were a lot of other things in her life before she got to that, and voting felt big to her and a little hard to her. I think there's some communities where justifying the value of voting is important, and I think this is an area where the advocacy groups come in, but I think that it's something that we can build into the way we talk to people in the voter guides. And of course, if you come to the United States and English isn't your first language, you may need in-language materials. And of course, if it's written in plain language, which is the subject of our webinar this afternoon, having it written clearly helps. People who vote sometimes often said to us things like, well, I vote when there's an issue I care about. I vote when I get around to it. I get my ballot, and sometimes I get around to sending it back, and sometimes I don't. So I think when that booklet lands on their kitchen table, it does feel a little bit like a test. There's a lot to do and a lot of things you have to plan. And if you don't, maybe you put it off and you put it off and put it off and you get to that last minute and I think sometimes people are a little embarrassed to send back a ballot that they haven't quite researched as well as they think they ought to. So things like having simple and clear information about candidates and issues in that guide. They're already in the guide. How can we make them easier for people to use? And again, how can we explain the options for voting to help them understand how it might fit into their daily life? It's always a little shocking to me when people haven't known that, but of course I'm an avid voter, right? I'm someone who's been part of elections all my life, as indeed probably many of us are. So not knowing, especially if it's something a little bit new, that vote by mail is possible. One of the gentlemen we talked to said he hadn't voted in about 10 years because he used to vote with his wife, but they'd gotten divorced and he's not gotten around to it. And in his conversation, it seemed like the social group that he was in kind of played down voting a little bit. And when he got to the page that described vote by mail, he sort of lit up. And I wondered whether part of this was that he could vote without having to make it quite so public in a group that maybe would make fun of him for voting. So we also talked to someone who was dealing with a serious illness, and she really wanted to go in person but wasn't sure she would feel well enough on election day. So just knowing that there were opportunities to go down to do early voting, to be able to go to someplace, made a difference to her. And because those were relatively new in her scope of the long time she'd been voting, she hadn't really paid attention to them because going to the polls had served her perfectly well. And finally, we have, of course, our avid voters, right? These are the people who vote all the time. They're the people who think that whether they think it's a duty or a right or an obligation or just something that they are eager and interested in taking part in, what they're looking for is complete information, which is sometimes at odds with our desire to give people just enough information. They might need some encouragement to be role models, and as many election officials do, put a invitation to become a poll worker into the guide, it's a chance to invite them to be even more engaged. So as we thought about what needs to be in these 24 average 24 pages voter guides that land in people's mailboxes, we thought about what those knowledge gaps are. And there were some pretty big ones. Among the brand new voters that we talked to, they didn't know things like that you needed to register in advance to vote. Now I know that may change as we go to Election Day registration, but for right now, that's the way it is. And part of the problem is that people who work in elections see elections as a process, right? It starts with getting registered, and then an election comes around, and you get your ballot, and you learn about things, and you vote, and you get the results, and then we start again for the next election. But that's not how people really perceive it out in the world. More often, they perceive it pretty close to the election. Oh my gosh, I want to go vote. There's an issue I care about, or there's a candidate I care about. And then they start working backwards to what do they have to do. So if they've never voted before, they may not realize those big 30-day registration requirements that you have to register in advance. They don't realize that you don't have to vote on everything on the ballot. And we have had people say they didn't turn in their absentee ballot or their vote by mail ballot because they hadn't finished it. Right? They didn't know about voting by mail. Some people thought you had to make an appointment to vote, thinking of it like a more general social service office. We heard the usual worry that, registering to vote signed you up for jury duty. They didn't know that they could get things in language. So all of these are things that we can help address by how we place information in the voter guide. And we'll talk a little about the right information at the right place a bit later in the second section. But knowing the kinds of questions that people don't even know to ask helps us know what kind of information to put in front of them. One of the things that we think is very difficult is this whole question of the different types of elections. Because when people think about elections, they generally start by thinking about the presidential election, the big every 4-year election. That's the one that has the public's attention. I mean, here it is, May 2015, and we're already deeply into the 2016 election. What happens to all those local elections in 15 that just don't even get mentioned in the national media or the state media? And we were surprised to find that even people who were regular voters, people who were in other respects fairly educated about elections, were not always clear about the difference in them. and where it fit in the election cycle and how it fit. And one of the most difficult ones of all were primaries. Just the whole notion of what a primary is. We started explaining it by using examples of the basketball tournaments, and how you sort of people sort of run against each other until you get to the finalists. No, it's not quite as elongated as the final four, but helping that. And one of the biggest challenges in California is explaining the top two primary. It seems like a pretty simple concept, but there are so many civic literacy gaps to understanding it. First of all, if you don't understand what a primary is, the notion of top two primary doesn't make sense. And if you don't understand primaries, or you didn't know, had never experienced one, the notion that top two is supposed to explain what's different about it doesn't make sense either. If you don't have a strong party affiliation, the notion that it's a nonpartisan primary, again, isn't really very relevant to you. And they kind of struggle to understand what works from the explanations. And part of that is that the explanations often start with a comparison. They start by saying, we used to do this, but now we do this. And people said, why are you telling me what you used to do? And of course, that's because we're trying to deal with so many different audiences at the same time. So I think thinking very carefully about getting the what we need to do today, this year, this election at the top. What is this election about? And then maybe at the end for the someone who might say, you might remember that in the past we voted in a different way, and now this is what it is. But what's that scope? I don't see any questions queued up, so I'll just say a couple more things in case you do, because we're about to get to the place for questions. The thing I wanted to end with thinking about in this section is that lack of civic literacy is not often, it's not that people are dumb, and it's not that they haven't done their homework. It's often about the gap between the concept and the action they're supposed to take. And I think this is a place where voter guides are not the only thing that addresses that gap, but they are one tool, and they're the tool that is election after election very specific to that election. So making sure that we've very much focused those guides and all the things that we'll talk about the cover and how we draw people into that guide to make sure that we're helping people understand what they have to do or what they can do to participate in this big thing we call an election. Jen, should we just run quite right forward? Jen's going to take over with the next topic, which is being helpfully official.
Thanks, Whitney. So what we do recognize is there is a difference between those official voter guides coming from the counties, coming from the state, and then also, for those frequent voters, they get inundated with all sorts of information, even partisan information. But those that are more infrequent, they may or may not get contacted by the campaigns or by a nonpartisan group or community group. But what we do recognize, having done these interviews, was that voters, they want to know where this information is coming from. So whether it's clear that it is partisan or from a community group, for those official guides, what we found helpful is actually right there in the front is a letter of sorts from the county registrar. Who is that person that's overseeing the elections in the county, or in the case of the state voter guides, the Secretary of State, and showing that person. They want to know who these real people are. And the welcome letter is actually quite helpful if it has all that information, once again, closing that civic literacy gap, all the information that they need to know to get prepared to go in and vote, whether it's vote by mail, early voting, or voting at the polls, and summarizing that key information. And then the importance of plain language, which we'll cover in the webinar later this afternoon. We want to make sure that those key principles are also included in this letter in the beginning. What we also recognize is, when we make these forms look official or these materials look official, it actually provides some confidence to the voters that this information is directed towards them and can be trusted. It is nonpartisan and it's quote-unquote official. So they're looking for some sort of county seals, postal insignias, and any indication that it's coming from the registrar. Now, what's funny is sometimes they don't even know what that means or who that person is or what they actually do, but if they can see that it's an official piece of government documents, that they can use that information to go in and prepare for the election, it's actually quite helpful. We also found that when we add those signatures, they like seeing the name of the person, not only that the person that's providing the overall voter guide, but also the ballot statements, the ballot measures, the title and organization is quite important. There was some confusion sometimes with the ballot measures, especially if you have a lot that's in the guide. Who's writing this? Who's funding it? Can I trust this information? And it's helpful when the title of the organization that's writing the ballot measure statements is included and incorporated. Also, trust trying to navigate through all the ballot measures. It provides some confidence for the voters to see that this is coming from where the source is, and then it being included in the official voter guide, that it's been vetted somehow to be included as part of this as part of the nonpartisan information. Now, having gone through all these interviews, what we found most interesting was the Voter Bill of Rights. Whether they were frequent voters or more specifically these infrequent voters and potential voters, this was a really great tool to help close the civic literacy gap because it provided such valuable information that we wanted to urge counties to use it with detailed information about how to use their rights. A specific example that we've shared before is at the Berkeley Public Library when we were interviewing with an ex-felon. He didn't realize that he was even eligible to vote until after carefully reading through the Voter Bill of Rights. And he did so, knowing that he's an adult literacy student. It took some time to go through, but it was incredibly helpful for not only that person to see that he was eligible, but even thinking through what other rights he had to be able to participate in our elections. And then finally, I just want to close out by saying that there's specific tips on how to use the voter guide to close these gaps because inexperienced voters, they just don't know how to use the voter guide. And we got to think through, well, if this is the only piece of information that this person is receiving about the election, how can we provide this information in a way that gives not only all the nuts and bolts and the how-tos, but also, especially for those frequent voters, they just want to go straight to the ballot measures and the candidate information, who am I voting for or against, or what am I voting for or against. And so we got to find a way to make this a teachable moment for not only the person that's receiving the guide, but also potentially any family members or friends that they're living in that household with that may not be registered and could potentially be a voting part of the public as well. So let's think through how we can prepare them to go to the polls, especially for those folks who don't necessarily participate in every single election. And then even thinking through, okay, well, here's a sample ballot, or what we would encourage is a practice ballot that they can mark up to take to the polls, once again, feeling confident and prepared going into Election Day. So now we'll open up to questions, and it looks like we have one here from Gary or Jerry.
Yeah, he asked, does anyone in California use a voting process flowchart included in the voter information pamphlet? We actually did a pretty careful audit of all of the voter information pamphlets across California. We collected a kind of random sample of early ones, and then we collected one from every one of the 58 counties and the State Department of State for the June primary last year. And we didn't see a voting process flowchart in the VIP. We did see some pages in the VIPs that included the process at the polling place. What do you do? Sign in, get your ballot, mark your ballot, put it in the box. Those sorts of processes were there. But they might be somewhere else. It might be a good page to include in the voter guide, but it also might be something that would be useful to have online. The other thing I would say is that the way you organize your table of contents might also function a bit as a flowchart because it kind of breaks out the steps into what the big pages are.
And I just want to add, so in a section of the manual, we cover design and layout as an important tool as well. And when we provide a sequence of actions that's shown with numbered steps and separate images, it's it's really great. I mean, even if you just think about, when you ride an airplane, you've got that colorful images and flowchart of what's to be done in case of an emergency. Well, once again, what can we do in reference to how the election process works that can be an easy flowchart or an easy sequence of events and images that folks can feel like, okay, if I'm just scanning through this voter guide, okay, this is what actually happens and what I need to be prepared for to get ready for the election. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so let's jump into the next section.
Okay, so the last big thing that we learned about civic literacy was a kind of question from people about whether what was in the guide was just for them. That is, it's addressed to them, but sometimes they wanted to know when it was speaking directly to them and when it was speaking sort of in general about the election. And I think this is important because we do try to personalize them. We have different versions of the guides that go to people so that we get the right ballot style with the right person. They're rewritten every election so that we are so that the deadlines can be correct. So things like having as much information as possible without overloading the cover, so that if you are someone who is an avid voter, you could, if you rip that cover off, you've kind of got everything on there, right? What the election is, when it is, the actual date, not the first Tuesday in November, but November 6, 2012, and maybe even your polling place. Now, I know that there's some technical issues about where we can do overprinting on the guides that has to do with how we print and mail them, but ideally, we can get as much as possible onto the front cover, because one of the election officials we talked about this is the 20-second rule. That is the length of time it takes to get from your mailbox to your kitchen. And will the voter guide survive that trip, or will it end up in the trash can instead? And things like making sure that we know what languages are available in language so that people can recognize it. Connecting it, when we connect that here's the registered voter, here's your polling place address, and here it's being delivered to you at your, wherever you live. Now all of a sudden we have a really clear cue that this voter guide is in fact specific to that address or that voter. And I think that's something that a lot of election officials do already, but where we can actually be much clearer about the informational part of it versus, say, a background picture or other information. The second one, and I think this is mostly done, but we were surprised at how often it wasn't, was making language, both accessibility and language voting assistance, very clear and very easy to find, and doing it in language in all versions of the guide. So if you're publishing in Spanish, Chinese, and English, that is, you would have in Chinese, in Spanish on the English version, but in English and Chinese on the Spanish version, and so on, so that the languages are visible no matter which version of the guide you pick up. You can see that all the other languages are available. And doing that in language, because people recognize their own language, even in a welter of English or in a page that's mostly in another language. It does help people pick up that that's available. In some other research in a different context, in a health literacy context, we found that people who often used second language options recognize them and notice them on the screen much faster than, say, people who didn't, which was great because there were a couple of places they knew to look for them. If it's on the web, they look, upper left. They look for it on the cover. They look for it on the back cover, and maybe even in the table of contents. So that making sure that those options kind of pop out. We've spent lots of time and effort, and they're not only legally required, but they cost money and they get translated, and all of this takes effort. And let's make sure that people are able to see quickly that that's available. We had a discussion when we did a public version of this workshop at the FOS conference about what the right way to handle the translations was. Is it half pages or facing pages or two sections of the guide if you're doing it in one book, or should they be in separate books? And we had a lot of different opinions on that, but the one that people felt didn't work quite as well as doing same page or alternate page translations. It just made the book harder to read, and so it made it feel longer because you had to turn more pages to get through the number of pages with the information, as opposed to doing a front half, back half of the book and maybe putting the sample ballot in the middle right between them. The next two are really about this whole question about how people understand what the measures on the ballot are and how it will affect them. Now, I know that this is hard for election officials because you're not usually interpreting or advocating for something, but simply presenting the information. So, and certainly a lot of the community groups and the good government groups do that work of trying to draw the line between why this particular measure might be useful for this particular community. But even in official guides, I think there are ways we can do it. The pages in the Secretary of State's office that were very structured, that had a kind of summary of the measure, what's it for, what's the yes and no or the for and against, and who provided pro and con statements. Those things tend to be kind of dumped in a very linear way in most of the voter guides, but we thought it would be, we found that it was very helpful when we mocked it up in our prototype in a structured way, so that you had, here's what you're going to see on the ballot, and then all across the page from each other, left half, right half of the page, we had vote yes and vote no. We've used the word pro and con statements here, but actually for and against worked better. People didn't really know what pro and con meant, but a heading that says people who are for this measure say this, people who are against this measure say that, and then printing the invited position statements. Doing that in a structured way means that, first of all, it means that the page that introduces a ballot measure, or the section of the page that introduces a ballot measure, has a distinct look about it, which is useful, but also that they can then see that there's a common structure to all of these ballot measures, whether it's, some sort of city council measure, or it's a budget thing, or it's something statewide, so that you can begin to learn. The guide becomes self-teaching when you do that. If you're someone who's already producing pro and con statements, we actually think it would be quite helpful to have a short version, like the intro to that pro and con statement, provided by the authors of those statements on the first page, so that you get just in the first page what it is, what yes and no mean, what voting yes and no means, and what the pro and con, the top for and against statements are. Gives you a bit of grounding, and also lets you see the signatures of who's for and who's against it. Most of the, especially financially related measures, often have a council statement and a financial analysis. And when we showed these to voters, and we used real material from an actual voter guide, they went right to that headline because they saw the heading and they thought, this will be great. We definitely want to know, what's the financial impact, and we want to know whether this is legal. And then they got into these big paragraphs of text and just said, I don't even know what this means. So we wondered whether if there's any way to present tax rate implications in a bulleted list or a table, or something that makes it easier to pick apart the pieces. If this is, something that's going to, taxes that are going to go up, or what was before and what's after, whatever the different kinds of information are, presenting them in a way that's visual, I think will help people see it, make it feel easier. Interestingly, one of the measures that was in our prototype actually was written pretty well, and the measure itself had good headings and was that people could go through. And people said, this is better than this other stuff. I thought I wanted the financial analysis statement, but I'm finding the information easier to read and easier to look at when it's in a structured format, and it's got good headings and short paragraphs that break it up. I know that you can't control how the measures are written, put in the voter guide what's there, but we can control what's around it and how we present it and how we make it clear that this is the legal text versus this is the information you'll see on the ballot. Excuse me. And the last thing that we've said before is that it's great to have a sample ballot. We suggest calling it a practice ballot. People were confused about the word sample. They didn't know if this meant this is a sample of exactly what I'm going to see when I go to the polls, or if it meant this is a sample of sort of kind of what a ballot looks like, but it might be different when you get it. We also suggest that there be just a little bit of intro text on the page that says to review this ballot, mark it as practice, and that makes it clear that it's not a real ballot. We don't have a great answer for another big question, which is how should you lay it out in the book? If you shrink it to fit on the page, then you end up with it's just too small to read. Ballot text isn't all that big anyway, and if you shrink a 11 by 22 ballot down to fit on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, you've got something that's too small. So you can either put it sideways, right? Not vertically the way it is now, but sideways. You can break it in half if it's not too big vertically, so that it's a little bit smaller than the full page and isn't so clearly, it makes it clear that it's a separate thing that you'll be looking at, and the bottom of the ballot might go on to the next page. But that's not as good because you're often breaking a contest. In this case, we would end up breaking the presidential contest in half. So in the end, I suspect that turning it sideways, as so many ballot voter guides do, is the best solution. And the other reason why this works a lot is that instead of simply getting to the page and saying, oh, there's an official ballot, and starting to read that page, as we saw many voters do, they stop, they see the heading that says this is a practice ballot, they read that little text, and now we can see that we're looking at the front, even if we have to turn the book sideways to do it. The other question that we got from people who work on voter guides was where that practice ballot should be in the book. We actually thought it might work in the back of the book. That is, they would learn about what's on the ballot, and then it would be in a nice anchored place at the back. We did have a lot of people say they lay out the entire guide, and then the practice ballot just goes in the middle wherever that is. So however it breaks, which has some challenges for reading order if it just comes in a kind of random place. But it was especially useful for people who were doing bilingual voter guides, where the first half was English and the second half was a second language, and then the practice ballot could just sit in the middle right between them. That's all of the things that we had to talk about civic literacy, and I wonder if there's anyone who with not just questions but also comments about what your experience has been and how this might work for you. Otherwise, we will continue on and just tell you a little bit about where you can get some of the resources that we've been talking about.
Thanks, Whitney. So as we said before in the beginning of the webinar, this is the third of 4 webinars, but all of this information is coming out of the manual. So here's the listing of all the webinars that we provided. The first being the general overview of the project and the project itself, and what were the main themes and recommendations coming out of it. And then we dive deeper into those 3 specific theme areas. The second webinar covered layout and visual presentation. We're talking about civic literacy today in this webinar, and then later today we'll talk about plain language. So hopefully you'll be able to see and have been a part of all 4. If not, once again, they're all going to be up online at cavotes.org. And then the manual itself, you can go ahead and download that online as well. And it covers all of the information that we're talking about. And I just want to highlight one specific tool coming out of that manual is this checklist. It's a great way to just go through all of the recommendations that we're providing and using it when creating or revising your voter guide. So it has all the information that covers what voters specifically need, not only thinking about frequent voters, but also those infrequent and potential voters. And then
I just want to break in a minute because while we're looking at the checklist, Allison has a question about whether input for people who aren't doing a full booklet but are simply going to separate inserts. Yeah, I think that all of the whether you're packaging this information into a booklet or whether you're doing it as separate pages of information, I think all of the information we've been talking about, all the recommendations still hold, and especially the one about thinking about how to use plain language and how to anticipate and answer voters' questions for them.
Yeah, and the same principles for the other two themes, like we talked about civic literacy today, and then the layout and visual presentation is quite important as well, and how that information gets presented.
Right.
So thanks for that question, Allison. And then in addition to the manual, we've also got some additional materials that are available at the Center for Civic Design website. It's got the full report and the sample voter guides, the prototype that was created, all of the 2014 primary voter guides, primary election voter guides from all 58 counties that we used to help provide that landscape and background information while we collect the research and prepare interviews with the voters and potential voters. And it's got some of those sample pages and prototypes, as well as some icons and illustrations that you can use in your voter guides. And this is all available at your fingertips online, in addition to the manual, which is great. If you have any questions, those are all of our websites. Please reach out to us. And we want to thank you again for joining us today, this morning. Hopefully we'll see you again this afternoon, or we'll see you online or in person at some point in the future. Thank you again for all of your wonderful work, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you in the future.